On this week's OIS podcast, we chat with Jay Duker, ophthalmologist-in-chief at New England Eye Center and ophthalmology chairman at Tufts University School of Medicine, to capture his perspective on the evolution of our industry, exciting developments in retina, and his work as a senior executive at EyePoint Pharmaceuticals. Enjoy the conversation.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the OIS Retina podcast. This is Firas Rahal again. I'm a partner at Retina Vitreous Associates Medical Group here in Los Angeles as a full-time vitreoretinal surgeon, and I'm a partner at Excite Ventures, a small venture capital firm that invests in the ophthalmology space. And I'm delighted today to have as my guest Jay Duker. Anyone who's in our business knows who Jay is, but by brief introduction, Jay is the chairman of the Department of Ophthalmology at Tufts, and Jay is currently taking on a new position. He has others, which I'm going to ask him about in a moment. Chief Strategic Scientific Officer at EyePoint, which is, of course, the company that's brought two commercial products to the market recently. One of great importance to us in the posterior segment called Utic, which we'll talk about a little bit, and they also have some important posterior segment pipeline products that Jay and I will talk about a little bit later. But initially, Jay, first, welcome and thank you for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks,
and
Buzz.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and really specifically your career path and all the things you've done. And we don't have 10 hours. You've done a lot that maybe have led you to this point in your career where you're wearing so many hats, and this particular hat of EyePoint Strategic Scientific Officer.
Sure. So I've been a practicing retina specialist for 30 years. I did my training in Philadelphia at Wills, and my wife is from the Boston area. So when it came time to look for a job, I didn't have a lot of choices. So I actually joined a private practice in Boston, Retina Associates, Dr. Scapins' practice, and I was in private practice for a year and a half. And what I hadn't realized when I joined the practice is that there was a civil war going on in the practice, and it was breaking up. And a lot of times in life, you look back and just say, right place, right time, and I got a little lucky. There was an opening at Tufts. They were starting a revamping of their department, and I got recruited over to be the head of retina there. And I was the head of the retina service for 10 years. At the time, Dr. Puliafito was the chairman, and we developed things like OCT, which I was very fortunate to be involved in the research. Along with assistance with things like photodynamic therapy and intravitreal steroids. We were the first to do that for diabetic macular edema. And Carmen left to go to Bascom 20 years ago, and I became chairman 20 years ago. And I really enjoyed the job and continue to enjoy the job because I'm a kind of hands-on organizational person. And one of the messages I would say to people out there of, how do you get from point A to point B in your career is just continue to do things that you like to do, the things that give you joy, and try to get away from the things that don't. And I, again, was fortunate and able to do that. And down through the years, like many of our colleagues, I consulted for various companies and assisted them with some of their plans in developing drugs. And about 5 years ago, I was introduced to a company and was asked to be on their board. It was actually a company that was developing a dry eye drug called 11 Bio, and they were interested in getting into the retina space, and they never made it into the retina space, but I stayed on the board. They failed in phase 3 and did a reverse merger with another company that was developing a bladder cancer drug. So here I was on the board of a bladder cancer company. I'm actually now chairman of the board of the bladder cancer company, and hopefully we'll have an FDA approved product next year. In the meantime, a couple colleagues and I started our own biotech company 10 years ago, Hemera Bio, which is a gene therapy company that's developing drugs for dry macular degeneration. And I also started a reading center with Nadia Waheed and Elias Rochelle that became a for-profit spin-out from Tufts. And one of the things I've been lucky is Tufts Medical Center has been very open to entrepreneurial activities. And they've allowed us to do things like that within parameters. And so it's been a great place to do that. In fact, I'm proud to say that two of my colleagues from Tufts Medical Center, Department of Ophthalmology, have become CMOs at biotech companies, and one became a CEO of a biotech company. So there's a little bit of a tradition of that where I work. Down through the years, again, I've had research interests in drug delivery to the eye and imaging, as I said, OCT. And about 4 years ago, I joined the board of a company called Cyvita, which used to be Controlled Delivery Systems. And for those of you who are old enough to remember, Cyvita Controlled Delivery Systems was the company that developed the Macular implant. And I had put many of those in many years ago during the AIDS crisis, and had a lot of experience with that drug delivery. And the company at the time was changing. It was really much more a PhD-oriented company, and Paul Ashton was the founder, who's really a brilliant guy. But Paul was interested in the next product. He wasn't so interested in commercializing products himself. And one of the things that came out of that was the Alimera spinoff, in that Alimera's drug was licensed from Controlled Delivery Systems, Cyvita, and it's based on the same technology, the Duracert technology that the company has worked on for 20 years. So I was on the board of that company. They got a new CEO. She became very interested in, the board became very interested in directing the company to be more commercial. And the commercial efforts were, first of all, to develop the Utic implant, which you had mentioned, which was developed internally for uveitis. And it's a very similar implant to the Illuvian implant that we use for DME. Obviously, it's manufactured in a different place, but it's based on the same technology, same type of drug release. And they also in-licensed a drug from Icon, which is now called Dexycu. And those products were both launched in the same year within a couple months of each other. And for those of you who know anything about commercial launches, launching one product is a lot. Launching two products within 6 months of each other for a small company was a tremendous achievement. And overall, I think things went pretty well. Nancy Lurker's the CEO of iPoint. They changed their name to iPoint a couple years ago. And Nancy and I had been really working on some strategic things over the last year. And finally, just several months ago, she said, Jay, why don't we formalize this? Why don't you I'll create a position where you just help us with our pipeline and our strategy. And as a result, I was no longer, it could be an independent board member. So I'm off the board now, and I have a part-time job with iPoint, helping them with pipeline and strategy. At the same time, I'm still chairman of Tufts. I still see patients a day and a half a week. I'm not as clinically active as I was many years ago. I've got 7 great colleagues in the retina service who are very happy to do the retinal detachments now. And so I do a lot of tumors and happy to do puckers and holes, but I'm not operating nearly as much as I used to. And again, we still have a very robust imaging research that I'm involved with. But I think the message is I'm not sure that if you'd asked me 20 or 30 years ago, are you going to end up doing all this stuff outside your regular job? I would have said, sure, I'm really interested in that. But that's the way it flowed. And there are certain things organizationally I think I'm good at, and I'm able to really think about products from the development phase all the way to what the label is going to look like and how much can the company charge for it, and you can really make money doing this. Those are the things as clinicians and scientists we don't always think about. So you can have a really great idea and it can look great in the laboratory, but if a company actually can't commercialize it, it's probably going nowhere. So you have to really think deeply about how best to design the trials in order to get a label, in order to be commercially successful. And that's kind of the bridge between some of the research that we do as clinicians and what the companies are more interested in.
That's a very complex career that you're running right now.
I guess
necessarily getting here, although that's kind of like.
So I left out a few things too. So I actually was acting chairman of dermatology at Tufts Medical Center a couple years back.
Are you kidding?
Yeah, the chair of dermatology left. They were down to 2 clinicians, and they said, hey, Jay, you run an outpatient department. You do pretty well at this. You can run dermatology. So I did it for almost 2 years. It's probably actually in my career one of the things I'm most proud of, since
you have to learn how to diagnose the dysplasia.
I know nothing about dermatology. I just know how to run a clinic. It's the same. It's the same idea. You put yourself in the patient's shoes. What would you want as a patient? And that's what you try to deliver. And so that really led me to realize at this point that I could probably balance multiple things in my life. And of course, I've got a terrific spouse at home, Julie, who has been very supportive, and
has to be understanding.
That's the only way you can do these kind of things.
You get a lot of calls, and you have to do a lot of things all the time. And this is great. What proportion of time do you think you're gonna if you can quantitate it, dedicate to this new position with iPhone?
So I think in the end, I mean, or as we evolve, it'll be just a couple hours a week.
Okay.
But a lot of it, frankly, is things I really like to do. I like to know what's going on with the pipeline. We're developing at iPoint EYP 1901, which is really what I was brought in to help do, which is a long-acting anti-VEGF. So I'm always interested in the pipeline and what other companies are doing and their probability of success and how they're doing it and how they design the trials. So being up on that to me is not work. I like doing that.
That's part of what you do anyway, as a department chairman, as a retina doctor,
exactly.
The interested observer.
So right now, though, I've been doing it just for a little more than a month. I had a lot of Zoom meetings to meet all the employees, and that we're doing a non-deal roadshow, which means we're talking to a lot of potential investors and analysts about EYP 1901 to introduce them. So it's been busy the last month, but I think once that's settled in and once we start our trial, my position is going to move from helping design the phase 1 onto the phase 2 and thinking about building the pipeline. Because one of the things iPoint does really well is deliver drugs to the posterior segment. They're really good at that. The Duracert implants, there's only 5 sustained release implants that are approved in the posterior segment, and iPoint's technologies in 4 of them. And the idea of putting an anti-VEGF in this form of a tyrosine kinase inhibitor, or TKI, into the Duracert implant, Paul Ashton thought of that years ago and started to develop it years ago, but it never really got off the ground for various reasons. And this is difficult. Look at a company like Genentech. They've been working on sustained release anti-VEGF really since they got their first FDA approval, and they're a really smart company with a lot of well-funded researchers, and they still don't have it FDA approved. So this is not easy, and the idea of de-risking a program by using a delivery system that's already been FDA approved really appealed to me. Also, the TKI that we're using was formerly known as X82 by Tyrogenex, and you may be aware that Tyrogenex did 2 trials, a phase 1 and a phase 2, as an oral delivery. And so that did show some promise as anti-VEGF delivered orally, but it was too toxic. But the nice part about that is also de-risk, because the FDA knows the product. They've seen their IND before. So we're taking an FDA-approved delivery system with a TKI that the FDA has seen through phase 2. And so ultimately, I think that really helps de-risk our program, despite the fact that we're behind many of our competitors.
So this product, since we're on it, let's hear more.
Sure.
This product was the oral product that was tested in clinical trials.
Vorolanib, the Vorolanib is the name of the TKI. Yes.
We were in that trial actually, group, and there were some systemic manifestations that were untoward, and I understood that. What are you guys doing with it now? And maybe in the course of explaining that, you can tell us about Duracert itself. What's the basis of the technology? How does it work here? And how has it been successful thus far?
So starting with Vorolanib, or any TKI, the VEGF receptors, all 3 of them are in that TKI family, the tyrosine kinase. And so the idea of using a TKI as an anti-VEGF has been around for a long time. TKIs are commonly used in cancer, and you may be aware that Graybug has a TKI, Sutent, which is very similar to Vorolanib. In fact, Sutent and Vorolanib were developed by the same protein chemist. And their idea, again, is to deliver a high enough dose of the TKI into the posterior segment that you can bind to the receptor and shut the receptor down, as opposed to binding the excess VEGF that's floating around in the eye, which is what we do with our injections now. There have been attempts at doing TKIs topically, the most recent being Panoptica, which has been into phase 2 with a topical TKI, and they were able to deliver enough TKI to the posterior segment to show some anti-VEGF activity. But again, they had problems with their formulation, and the dose that was getting into the cornea was really probably too high, and they had some corneal toxicity. So the idea behind delivering the TKI directly into the vitreous, we've been doing that for many years, but it bypasses the corneal toxicity, hopefully, and certainly bypasses the systemic toxicity, because the amount of drug we put in is a fraction of the daily dose that was given orally. So tyrogenix. Yes, the idea again is to be both long acting, and the other thing we're looking to develop is consistency. So I've said all along, we always talk about, the injection burden. It's not the injection burden, it's the visit burden. If we don't mind doing injections, you got a patient sitting in your chair, would you rather inject them and be sure that they're going to get an anti-VEGF, or say, hey, maybe we'll skip this month, come back next month, maybe we'll skip? So that what we all should be looking for in sustained release is not just effectiveness early, but consistency. If I've got a sustained release product that in some patients wears out in 3 months, in some patients it wears out in 9 months, I'm not sure how that useful that is to me. Because if I know it might wear off in 3 months, I got to start seeing the patient in 3 months. It hasn't worn off, I see him in 4 months. Then I see him in 5 months. And then all of a sudden I'm saying, well, why am I not just injecting this patient if they're coming in every month? So it's the visit burden, not the injection burden.
I totally agree. I'm glad you used that term. I think we should use it more often. The visit burden is the rate limiting factor.
Right.
Son or daughter taking work off. There, it's not a big deal.
Yeah, and maybe home OCT will help, maybe. We'll see how that pans out. I think the devices will work, and I think the technology will be there. It's a question of who's going to pay for it. And the problem I still have with the home OCT is, remember, many people, my colleagues, will stand up at meetings and say, hey, we're undertreating. Look at the statistics, and we, Usha Chakravarty just published a paper where she looked at results of multiple studies where there was sawtooth OCT findings, and found that the patients who had the sawtooth OCT findings didn't do quite as well as the ones who stayed dry. But the idea behind home OCT is, well, we're going to let you develop fluid again and then come in and get a shot. Well, that's probably in the long term not optimal. So while I think it will work, it would be better to have a very consistent 4-month, 6-month, 8-month device that we can repeat and just say to people, hey, you're going to be good. We'll give you a shot and come back in 4 months and we'll see how you're doing and probably give you another one. I think that type of device would be helpful. And I can recall, I go back to the Ganciclovir implant where I put literally hundreds of them in. And in CMV retinitis, if you put in a Ganciclovir implant and it started to work in 2 or 3 weeks, none of them failed before 6 months. They all work for a minimum of 6 months. So I could tell that patient, unless you're having a problem, you don't have to come back for 6 months. And if you come back 6 months, then we'll put a new one in, or I'll just watch you till it reactivates. That's the kind of consistency we should be looking for in all the slow release devices. And there's, as you know, quite a few out there that are being developed.
So but this one, the Durasert Technologies is the goal again. We know about its success with small molecule, and maybe you can speak to that a little bit. Is this also a small molecule or a large molecule?
It's small. And so that the thing about Durasert is that the molecule has to be relatively small and relatively soluble, and has to be able to be mixed with the plastic, so that the drug and the plastic are in a sense annealed together, and the plastic does go away, it's PVA, and that the original technology, both in the steroid implant and the Ganciclovir implant, was it was covered by a polyamide tube. And the polyamide is the drug doesn't, it's non-porous, the drug won't go through it. And so the opening in the tube was what determined the release rate. So for example, like a Utic, it's a long cylinder of polyamide with a drug core, and at each end, there's little silicone plugs, and that's where the drug comes out of. So you can change the release rate by making the opening bigger or smaller. With the Durasert technology that is biodegradable, which is what we're putting in EYP-1901, there's no polyamide tube. You just have the drug core. So it dissolves faster, which frankly is what we want. I don't think any of us want an anti-VEGF that lasts 3 years.
No.
especially if it's not consistent. Just like, you can look at the DME market and say, there's, lots of reasons why we don't turn to steroids more for DME. But I think a lot of our reactions at the beginning when the 3-year implant came out for DME is that's just too long. We're worried that if we put one in and the patient doesn't come back, is there going to be a problem? So I think if you talk to retina specialists about steroids and about anti-VEGFs, there's a sweet spot that's, I think, between 4 to 6 months and 8 to 12. That's the responses you always get. And right now, we can have patients, plenty of patients can go out 3 months with our current drugs, but inconsistently. One patient can go 3 months, the next patient can't go more than 5 weeks. We need consistency.
So in the beginning of treatment, I totally agree. It relegates us to the lowest common denominator. You have to see the person at that low end until you're sure that they're one who can make it 3 months. So again, visit burden until you have sort of a low end that's really secure. 4 months, 6 months. 6 months would be the sweet spot to me. A lot of people are talking about 4 because that may become at least the initial reality. Great. Consistency is absolutely the key here if you know, but if you don't know and you have 70% make it that long, then you're still seeing them every month or two, and you haven't really helped your cause.
And you got another problem too when we start to talk about other drugs in the space, like for gene therapy, for example. There's no reason that gene therapy will not work as a drug delivery system. The problems, again, is I think there's going to be an inconsistency in response. And that some eyes will never need another injection and some eyes will. And you don't know who that is ahead of time. And that also brings up a problem for payers, which is if I'm going to pay, I don't know, $100,000 for gene therapy, but this patient's still going to need monthly or bi-monthly anti-VEGF injections, I'm not paying for that. Now, granted, the companies probably can figure out some type of outcomes analysis to determine that, but that's not obvious to me that will be doable right off the bat. So, again, there's a lot of stuff in the pipeline that's really exciting, and it's hard to really look at it now and say this is going to work, this is not going to work. I think there's going to be several alternatives in 5 or 10 years that will offer different profiles, different costs, and you might vary it depending on the patient. And frankly, if they work through different mechanisms of action, you may mix mechanisms of action. And going back to the Utic implant for a second, which is a kind of a microdose, slow release steroid implant, lasts 3 years for uveitis. The great part about it is there's no problem layering on other uveitis drugs on top of it. If you want to give methotrexate or Cellcept, if you've got a patient who breaks through, it looks like about 60% will not break through. But if 40% do, that's okay because combo therapy in chronic uveitis is fine. And you've got that steroid on board, which because it's microdose has a surprisingly low level of side effects. The intraocular pressure rise in the phase 3 Utic trials was in the vicinity of 1 to 2%, significant. So much lower.
Alimera exactly the way, with the Illuvian. Exactly the way you just described.
Right.
I'm giving it to some people. It's still not the majority of my patients, but it's a substantial minority of patients who've been getting this. And then I basically augment their therapy with spot anti-VEGF therapy. And they got this sort of low-level baseline steroid. It's really a nice combination.
It is. And that especially people who you can't get off of monthly or every 6 weeks anti-VEGF or diabetics. Yeah. Because the difference again is, I don't know if you agree, but for me, if a diabetic gets a little bit of fluid again for a couple of weeks, I don't see that doing long-term damage. So I don't mind saying, okay, we'll give you a steroid and we'll give you an anti-VEGF, and especially in a pseudofake. And if you want, you get kind of a rhythm to it, and they seem to last. The short-acting one lasts 4 or 5 months, and see the patient back. You got a little CME, or they notice it. You just do it again. I think wet AMD is a little bit different. I'd prefer them not to reoccur if I can avoid it.
I totally agree. The diabetic, and that's a large part of my patient population, the diabetic macular edema patients, their vision tolerates a little bit of fluid pretty well, and I'm managing them more conservatively. The wet AMDs, I agree, even though I manage a significant proportion as conservatively, but it's based on lifestyle and social issues. not based on my knowledge
Yeah.
of what's going to happen.
But you know, that's one thing that I've learned in 30 years of practice too, is I don't, at least in my patient population, you got to balance those. You can't be dictatorial. You can't do one size fits all, or your patients aren't going to be happy and you're not going to be happy. You need buy-in from the patients and the family. And then if it doesn't go the way you want it to go, you all agreed of the approach. So
this is why maybe for the first time, I don't know, at least the most prominent time that I recall, that we have all the clinical trial data to show that monthly works better than PRN, and extending them out can be problematic. Yet we all do it 98% of the time because those other factors are really important to the actual patient.
Right. And now many of us have 10 years and 12-year results of treat and extending to a fixed interval, which is really what we do. We don't, we treat and extend a fixed interval. Most of the time we just stick with that fixed interval for forever. But a 2-month interval or a 7-week interval, and we've been doing that for 10 years and the vision's 2030.
Yeah.
And you think, I've given them half as many injections as I would have if I had stuck to the label.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's not science, that's anecdote. But that's the way I think it does for the majority of people, it does. And it's individualizing therapy based on those other aspects, the fellow eye, the patient expectations, their social situation, their family, all those things go into it. And it can change. You know, I can recall patients who I was treating monthly because they wanted it. And then, you know, one woman in particular, her daughter got breast cancer. And she said, I can't come in monthly anymore. I need to take care of my daughter. So we treat and extend her out to 3 months. And unfortunately, her daughter eventually passed away, and she started coming back more frequently because that's what she was comfortable with. So, you know, that's life. And that's, again, the tragedy and the beauty of what we do.
Yeah. Let's take that and run with it. You know as much or more than anyone about these other potential products from other companies coming about. What's your view of the landscape? So therapy or regenerative or other carrier molecules?
So I'll kind of say that, you know, in general, we have, you know, similar molecules to what we have now. You know, brolucizumab was FDA approved, and that it doesn't look like it unless they figure out what was causing the inflammation. That's going to get a lot of market share. But that was, you know, just again, like we all believe Eylea was just a little step up from Lucentis. It was just another step up. Maybe more patients could go 3 months, but it wasn't really extended release, and you didn't have the consistency. Abicipar, you know, didn't make it. I don't know what the future is for that. Allergan got bought by AbbVie, and so it's unclear where that drug is going. We have Conbercept, which is the Chinese drug. It was approved in China, that has been studied now through 2 phase 3 trials in the United States. And I don't know the results. I would guess it's going to be like Eylea. And then we have Faricimab, which it's a combo by Genentech, which looks like it's going to be perhaps superior to Lucentis in diabetes and perhaps about the same in macular degeneration. But I think that's going to likely get approved. The safety looks good and it was non-inferior. I don't see any reason. But those are all kind of in that same category. There's a couple others in the pipeline. Opthea's got a drug that blocks all the forms of VEGF. They did a combo trial, and of course, when you do a combo trial in phase 2, you know, for phase 3, you do a combo trial, you got to show superiority of visual acuity. So I'm not sure they're going to be able to do that. So then you have the gene therapies, which I mentioned already. There's 2 big companies out there, REGENXBIO, which is doing subretinal, and they've shown some, you know, pretty good dose response in their phase 1 and really good safety. But of course, they had like 9 of the best surgeons in the United States operating. You know, my contention is for wet AMD, subretinal surgery is not going to make it through phase 3, because when you look at it and you say, well, okay, you got to do 2 trials. You know, maybe you'll get away with 300 patients. You got to have how many centers to do those trials? 100?
Yeah, at
80?
least 50.
How many of those surgeons have ever done subretinal surgery? And even in the best of hands, you do a simple vitrectomy, it's a 1% rate of complications. So I don't know. I don't think safety is going to do it. And they, I think, may agree, because now they've got the clear side applicator and they're looking at doing suprachoroidal, and that may work. Ultimately, though, I think there's no reason not to do intravitreal, which is what is being done by, you know, the company that formerly was known as Avalanche, that started out as doing subretinal, and now they're doing
Yeah, yeah. When they
intravitreal.
were Avalanche, it was still subretinal.
Yeah, and they were saying the same thing that Regenexx was saying. Oh, it'll never work intravitreal. Oh, wait a second, it's actually working. And they've got some pretty good results. I think they picked a vector that they could get IP on, and it was a vector that got into the retina better, but it's also a vector that causes inflammation, and they're dealing with that now, and that may or may not be a long-term issue for them. But I said already, gene therapy will work as drug delivery. I'm not sure that wet AMD is the best application, but we'll find out. So we talked about iPoint EYP-1901, which is the Duracert implant erodible with vorolanib, which is a TKI. We're just finishing our IND enabling studies, and we hope to send the IND into the FDA later this year. And we have lined up some sites already to be, the phase 1 sites, and we hope to dose the first patient in the first quarter of 2021. It's dose escalation, and we'll be watching them carefully with OCT, and it's going to be only patients who have been previously treated, and we'll see how it goes. In that space, though, I mentioned Graybug. They've got Sutent, and they've got a different delivery system. And while I think their results look good, if you look at their 3-month results, they had a 90% rate of no rescue in their phase 1. 6 months, it was about 70%. But they had problems with migration of the drug into the anterior chamber, and I'm not sure that they've solved that yet. And if they have, then I think that they're on to phase 3. Ocular Therapeutics also has a TKI. They're using axitinib, which is off patent, so anybody can use it. And they have their masters in hydrogel. They've got the hydrogel implants that they put into the
blocker, the device in the tear duct. Yeah,
exactly. And so they're putting in the posterior segment. They've done a phase 1 trial, 8 patients, Australia, and it looked like 50% responded pretty well. So they're developing along those same lines. RPO, they're known for ROCK inhibitors for glaucoma, but they're also now getting into the posterior segment. They're going to do a 6-month delivery of steroids using their print technology, and they're also looking at TKI, I believe, for wet AMD. And then you have Clearside. Clearside's also doing the same thing. They just got an IND using their suprachoroidal applicator and axitinib. So the idea of using a TKI for anti-VEGF is not unique. What is unique is these delivery systems. Remember, most of them, at least for the time, will be zero-order kinetics. And so if you've got a certain drug level in the eye and it stays steady for months, you can probably damp down the receptor and not have it act in the negative ways that we're seeing. But we're going to find out. And then the other big one is Kodiak. Kodiak did a very large phase 1 where they had multiple different indications, and they want to jump right to phase 3 with multiple indications. They have this very large molecule. And, if you really look at their wet AMD results, I'm not sure it's quite as good as like what Graybug reported. They only have about a 50% non-rescue rate at 6 months. And if you look at their OCT data, which they just reported at the Retina Society, newly diagnosed, they only reduced their OCTs by about 80 microns. And, it depends who you enrolled. But if you look most studies, it's about 120 microns for the newly diagnosed. So, again, we'll see. It's promising. And they've got a lot of capital, and they're very well backed, and they're a bunch of smart people. And that may work. I think I'm anxious to see how this drug delivery does with multiple injections over time, because I don't know if it's biodegradable or not. But that's going to be in phase 3. We're going to, it's going to be a couple of years before we see results, but that's something to look for as well.
Extended duration seems to fall into these sort of broad.
Yes.
You've covered a lot of them. Let me just review for our listeners for a minute, because I want your take from the 20,000-foot view. We have longer acting drugs themselves. Mm-hmm. We have carrier molecule concepts. We have surgery, and we have, implantable devices. And we have gene therapy or regenerative medicine concepts. Those are sort of 4 different broad camps of how to lengthen the durability of some of our highly effective treatments. Do you view any one or two of those as more advantageous, more realistic, more near term? How do you view?
So I think in general, intravitreal delivery is the way to go. It's It's simple,
We agree
it's
on this.
safe.
I'm glad
We
to
do
hear
it right in the office. Patients, whenever
It's
you read a perspective of a company that's trying to do it differently, they all say the same thing. Oh, these intravitreal shots, the patients hate them and they're so
yeah,
painful and they don't want to come in.
yeah,
No, it's just not true. They may not want to come in, but it isn't because it's uncomfortable. So a 30 gauge needle in a TB syringe is a really good drug delivery system.
yeah.
It just is. So, I think part of the problem, and I'm not a protein chemist, I think it's very hard to keep a protein at 98.6 degrees for an extended period of time without it breaking down. I think that's the ultimate problem. And that you can wrap it in some sort of material that may help, but I think it's going to lose its potency. And that the problem, again, with small molecules can be off-target effects like the TKIs, but they can be put into different matrices and have them last a long period of time. And that's why EyePoint and other companies are looking at TKIs just for that reason. Small molecules that can be put into hydrogels or other type of material that will biodegrade. So I would say in general, if I were handicapping, look for the intravitreal injections because it's simpler and they're easy to do, and you don't have this other layer of complication on top. Because remember, when those companies do a phase 3 trial, they need a control group. Wet AMD control group right now, it's EYLEA every other month.
Yeah. High bar. It's a high bar.
It's a high bar. But a high bar for safety.
Yeah.
Those Lucentis, EYLEA, they're extraordinarily safe drugs. We are so lucky that of the safety profile there. And so that's a high bar for safety. So we didn't really talk about the implantable, the Genentechs. And again, the initial results in the phase 2 and the phase 3 of efficacy or non-inferiority of vision. And I was actually a little surprised because I wasn't going to I was going to go on a limb and say I wouldn't be surprised if it was superior because you were delivering a constant level of anti-VEGF. But if it was superior, I think we would have heard, but it's non-inferior. I've been worried all along about the safety, and this again goes back to the ganciclovir implants. When we put a ganciclovir implant in across the sclera and the conj broke down over the implant, all those patients got endophthalmitis. I learned early, you have to take them out. And otherwise they're going to get infected. And I'm worried that as you do multiple injections and break down the conj over these, the endophthalmitis rate will be high. And in fact, it was 1.8% in the phase 2 and it was 1.5% in the phase 3. And so if I, go to one of your friends and say, hey, I got this new procedure and it's much more convenient for your patients and it really is good visual results, but it carries a 1.5% rate of endophthalmitis.
Yeah, not happening.
No, I don't think when you spin it that way, many of us will be anxious. But I do think it still may get FDA approved. It may, despite that. It wouldn't surprise me if the FDA says that's just too high a rate. And I think people will use it. But I don't think it's what we're looking for. I don't think everybody is going to say, yeah, let's give it to me and let's go. I think it will be for select cases. So the market is still open. That's kind of my point, is that nobody's figured this out yet. This is a really hard thing to do. There's a lot of companies have tried. A lot of smart people have taken stabs at it. But I like our chances at EyePoint because of, as I said already, we got a proven delivery system and we've got a TKI that's been through phase 2.
The irony of what you said is not lost on me. And let me paraphrase it for you in a minute. We inject people with 30 and 32 gauge needles all day long, and we have a lot of companies and product developers saying exactly what you just said, which is, oh, the patients hate this, it's torture. We got to find a way to do it differently. And a lot of people, are trying to develop sort of topical therapy. You mentioned one earlier. Great, nothing wrong with that. Yet, ironically, I've been pitched many times as an investor, not as a retina doctor, from the glaucoma people who say, oh, drops are terrible. We need to find an
50% don't take them. Exactly. So that's where your experience as a clinician and your grounding in reality will make you stop and say, that doesn't make sense to me. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Injections are well tolerated.
So they are well tolerated. And, again, I go back, I sound like an old man. I guess I am because, back before we had the ganciclovir implant, we were injecting ganciclovir and foscarnet into the eye in patients, and I was doing it weekly. Yeah. I had patients come in every week for a shot for years because they didn't want to go on IV.
I worked with Merck Heinemann in those days. He published some of that early work, doing it every other week when they stabilized.
Right. And so monthly or every 6 weeks seems like nothing.
Yeah, totally. Totally. You know, I want to go back on one historical point that is unique to you. I didn't have a chance to ask you earlier. Utic is a steroid product, and we're talking about intraocular steroids. I haven't forgotten that actually you were the first person that I'm aware of to describe the intravitreal triamcinolone. It has tremendous effect. We were all blown away by the wow factor. We talked about it. Everyone's talked about it. Out of interest, and I have my own personal feelings about this, most of this stuff turns out to be kind of happenstance and what's the concentration readily available. Did you come up with the 4 milligrams because it happened to be what's in one pen?
So I'll tell you the whole story. And this is one of those things where things came together. So Adam Martinez,
I know Adam.
You may know. Yeah, Adam was the first author. Adam was the first author on the paper. And so Adam was our fellow. And he had trained in Indianapolis. And one of his mentors there had trained in Australia, where they believed AMD was an inflammatory disease. And they gave subtenons steroids and eventually intravitreal steroids for it. And actually, Moshe Lahav, who was the head of retina at the Boston VA and was at Tufts when I first arrived, he believed it as well. And he gave his wet AMD patients subtenon steroids. So Adam comes to Boston. He's our fellow. We have a patient that, has got edema and has AMD. And Adam says to Carmen, oh, we should give him steroids. And Carmen's like, okay. And so they gave him triamcinolone. And the patient comes back a month later, and the vision wasn't any different. And the fluorescein looked the same. But the OCT showed that the intraretinal fluid went away. And so we had OCT. No one else did. This was back in 2000. And so because of that, we said, wow, this works on intraretinal fluid. It didn't work in wet AMD. So that day, there was a patient with birdshot in the office with CME. We gave him triamcinolone. So Adam says to me, Jay, I think this will work for diabetes. And I'm like, Adam, this ain't work for diabetes. Diabetes is an inflammatory disease, but let's try it. So we did, and it worked. So it was really Adam who pushed it. He was the first author on the paper, and he dragged us along. And again, here we are still, years later, still delivering steroids. And if it weren't for the anti-VEGFs coming out, I think steroids would be absolutely frontline treatment, because they certainly work and they have longevity. It's their side effects that none of us like.
I think we're underusing steroids in diabetic retinopathy.
I don't know.
There's a certain stigma with steroids, but they do work. In my hands, the edema.
Yeah, it does work, and I really like combo for patients with macular edema that I just can't get rid of. I've got some diabetics now who I've been injecting for years and years and years monthly, and they're sick of seeing me. I'm sick of seeing them, and so I offer them, especially if they're pseudophakic, give them an Ozurdex, give them an anti-VEGF, and that will consistently for me work for 4 to 5 months. So you do 2 injections every 4 to 5 months, as opposed to 5 injections every 5, and I don't do it on everybody. Some people, when they hear about high pressure and cataract, they just say, just give me the anti-VEGF. But I think there is more of a role, and I do think that that idea of the microdose of steroids gives you another area of safety. I think, again, both the Iluvien and Utic have a much lower incidence of intraocular pressure rise than does Ozurdex. You're not delivering as much drug, and so you really want the eye to be under probably better control. But like you said already, there's no problem if somebody breaks through, and so instead of giving them monthly injections, you're giving them every 3 to 4 months. That's preferable.
There it is from the guy who first put the steroid in the eye. Although now when I see Adam, which will come up, I'm going to credit him. That's great information.
And again, we weren't the first. We were the first to document that it worked, because we had OCT.
Jay, this has been wonderful. We could talk for hours. You're like a bucket of information here. It's really fun. I really want to thank you for coming on and sharing with us both your personal experiences and this great vast area of professional knowledge and experience that you have. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. It's been fun.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening in to our conversation with Dr. Duker. We hope you found it as engaging, informative, and inspiring as we did. To keep up with all the innovation happening in ophthalmology, visit Ophthalmology Innovation Source at OIS.net or find us on Twitter and Facebook. Until next week.